Hi everyone, welcome to Open Democracy's weekly live discussion. The title of this week's webinar is What About the Menz? Depression, Alienation, Toxic Masculinity and the Far Right. At Open Democracy, we seek to challenge power and inspire change. My name is Nandini Archer and I will be hosting this discussion today. So thank you everyone for joining. We really want this conversation to involve as much of you as possible. So particularly thank you to all of those who submitted your questions and your comments ahead of time. And I'll try to get through and address as many of them as we can. If you are joining on Zoom and if you have a question or comment for us now, or later on in the discussion, you can click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and type into the chat window. And if you're joining on Facebook, you can add your input there and it will be fed back to us. So also, as usual, I'd like to apologize in advance for any disruptions or background noises, etc. We're trying something fairly new here and we're all working from our homes. So hopefully it will all run smoothly. So before we kick off, I just wanted to say that we heard the sad news that David Graeber passed away today. He was a regular contributor to Open Democracy. He was a professor, an activist, an anarchist, and very important all-round and interesting thinker. I have a number of friends myself that were particularly close to him, so my thoughts are with them today. And he also once let me use his toilet at Notting Hill Carnival a few years back. So he was also extremely kind. And I'm sure he would have loved this discussion today and listening to all these great speakers. So let me introduce today's panel, and I'll try not to fangirl. On today's panel, we have Shon Faye, who's a writer, presenter, editor, artist, comedian, and an activist for LGBTQ women's and mental health rights. She's an editor at large at Dazed and has contributed features and comment journalism to The Guardian, Independent, Vice, Verso, and many others. We also have Dan Hind, author of many books, including a critical analysis of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules of Life, 12 Rules for Life. And then we have my great colleague and ally, Adam Ramsey, who is the main site editor at Open Democracy and also author of the recent essay, Queer Eye, Jordan Peterson and the Battle for Depressed Men. And at some point, I'm sure we'll get that link to that great piece in the chat for those of you that have missed it. So without further ado, I'm going to start off with a question for each panelist, and do carry on writing your questions in the chat box. So to start with, Shon, let's start big, if I may. Of course, you made that wonderful video a few years back where you really deconstructed mental health and politics. So could you explain, why is mental health political?
Well, I think yeah, mental health is political. I think what my work is focused on is the idea that there's sort of two discourses, if you like, in public life about mental health that exist at the moment. One is very much this kind of atomized, individualistic idea of mental health as perhaps a personal struggle that you have to overcome, and you can see that with stuff like the fact that Prince William and the Duchess of Cambridge are sort of patrons of mental health charity and talk a lot about mental health in public. So there's this idea of awareness and disclosure, and we all need to kind of talk more about our mental health, and it's very focused on the individual. And alongside that, this huge industry, both of the pharmaceutical industry, promising us kind of chemical assistance with mental health and self-care, the kind of idea of both the self-care industry and the idea of, you know, sometimes therapy, but also consumerist forms of self-care as a sort of antidote. And then the flip side to that is actually something that isn't particularly discussed, you know, in mainstream public discourse, is the idea that mental health is political, because there might actually be social causes for it, about the conditions, the material conditions of our lives are as responsible as sort of individual chemistry of our brain. So for example, the fact there's a high preponderance of mental health problems in prisons. Like 25% of women and 15% of men in British prisons experience psychosis or have illnesses that have psychosis associated with them, or that I don't know, that men of Afro-Caribbean heritage in Britain are probably 5 times more likely, they're 5 times more likely to have schizophrenia. So if you look at those, it's actually, well, if you sort of talk about it as if there's no systemic causes or underlying causes, there's actually some pretty unpleasant and pretty, well, fairly racist or classist implications to the idea of that very individualized model of mental health. So that's kind of why I would argue it's political, is that we need to look at the sort of social causes and perhaps have a more expansive view of the fact that what we define even as mental illness is very tied to capital, very tied to the idea of whether or not you're a functioning worker in a capitalist society.
Great. And Dan, I'd love you to explain a bit, to start with, the cult that is Jordan Peterson. I know that you tried to change your background earlier on, your Zoom background, to Jordan Peterson, but it didn't work.
Yeah, no, that's sort of like, that's sort of flagging up how this is likely to go. It's interesting. I mean, like, I first was moved to write a book by Richard Dawkins, and I think in some ways Peterson is a sort of successor to Dawkins, as someone who provides apparently cosmic and grounded certainties about reality to a confused and not exclusively, but I would say primarily male audience. One of the things that's interesting about them is that they're radically at odds cosmologically. Peterson trades in sort of very vague spiritual stuff of the sort that Dawkins set his face against. And I think this speaks to something quite interesting about, in a way, the vacuity of these figures. It doesn't really matter what the content is so much as the certainty with which it's delivered. And to pick up on what Shon was saying, the extent to which it preps you for life in contemporary capitalist society. It preps you for competition, and competition of an intensely individualistic kind. And it tells youngsters who are perhaps feeling untethered that there is basically one way of being in the world, there's one way of being right in the world, one way of being, as it were, cosmically correct, and that is to sign up for whatever the, as it were, the metaphysical freight happens to be. As I say, in Peterson's case, it's this very eclectic mix of Eastern and Western spiritual traditions, religious traditions. He has adopted and adapted Taoism as part of his sort of his pitch to people. But underlying it all, in a way that does echo Dawkins, I think, in a quite interesting way, is this notion that we are fundamentally individuals, we are fundamentally competitive, and that we are fundamentally responsible for our own conditions on our own. Now, you said, well, can you explain the phenomenon? I mean, how long have you got, in a way? But one of the things I think is worth flagging up is there is a sense, I think, that this is a generational phenomenon to some extent. People who are my age, my late 40s, we grew up in a world that was fracturing to some extent, that was fraying to some extent because of the impact of Thatcherism, because of the effects of the neoliberal turn on the social democratic settlement, which was much more conscious of, I think, the social nature of our lives, the sense that we are dependent on each other. And that life world still to some extent existed when I was a child, decreasingly so throughout the 80s and 90s. I think people born in 2000 live in a radically different life world. And they are looking for certainty. And interestingly, I was looking at, Peterson is he's a younger boomer. He comes from an age where he can actually appear to be a sort of grandfatherly figure. And I think part of the story is that people my age have been really bad at understanding what's been happening to society as it's happened, really bad at understanding the revolution in social life that we've been living through. And so someone like Peterson, who turns out is very confident and says, actually, this is how we should understand human nature, it's how we should understand human flourishing, I think is very appealing to younger people. But I'm interested to to see whether that's whether that sort of strikes a chord with people in the comments. But I've talked enough, probably.
I don't know, Adam, do you have anything to add to that before I ask you a question? Because I know that you also touched on Peterson in your latest essay.
Not really, and I should be honest. I feel like I've learned a lot about Peterson from Dan, so I thought I'd suggest he comes along today so you can get the pure form. But no, I think that's right, very much. And
also in your recent piece, you talk about going undercover in the ultra conservative far right summit in Verona, and there are quite a lot of funny, pithy lines in your piece. So I'm going to quote from it directly. You say, "As I gossiped around that Veronese conference hall, I realized I had rarely met people who so desperately needed to learn from the Fab Five." What did you mean by this? I have to admit, at first I didn't quite get what Queer Eye was all to do with this. So come on, convert us. What's so great about Queer Eye?
I suppose the thing is, Queer Eye, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a show on Netflix where 5 gay men kind of make over the lives of a usually straight, usually man, although not always either of those things. And I think the thing that is really powerful about it for me, and it was my partner who sat next to me here who kind of convinced me to get into it, is that they all clearly understand, all the hosts clearly understand that what they're doing is unpicking the effects of toxic masculinity on the men who they're working with. And the way that sort of competitive and therefore I would see kind of ultra neoliberal society interacts with toxic masculinity to create a sort of competitiveness around men that we're not meant to open up emotionally. We're not allowed to enjoy nice things because often nice things are kind of seen as feminized, and as a result, suffer a particular kind of depression. Now, of course, everyone in society suffers from the depression pandemic, and it's not particularly exclusive to men. But what they recognise is the way that that to help men is not just about giving them nice things; it's about helping them unpick the damage that toxic masculinity has done to them. So I suppose what I meant by going around the conference hall in Verona, where and Nandi was also in Verona at the protests outside this conference, covering them. So you'll be familiar with this, but it's a very, very male context where all of these, I thought, men who seemed as depressed as I was, you can just sort of tell, were kind of very, very sort of stuck up and desperately clinging to social hierarchies. And I think any kind of analysis of what it is that makes people quite so miserable has to understand that more unequal societies are less happy, both more unequal in terms of income and wealth distribution, but I think also in terms of distribution of power by gender and race and so on. And so these people who were, in a sense, victims of these power structures of patriarchy were working hardest to reinforce the patriarchy that was making them miserable. And so I suppose, in a sense, it was that experience that got me thinking about, how is it that we deal with the far right? And, why is it that the far right is so rooted in men of a particular age who often appear to have that kind of experience? And you think about the sort of roots of Trumpism, the roots of Orban. Orban in Hungary, where I've spent quite a lot of time, is totally obsessed with the idea of reinforcing the family and, gender politics. They particularly hate trans rights. You go around and talking to far-right activists or just far-right voters in Central Europe, which I spent most of February doing. And, people who will probably never knowingly have met a trans person will talk about how, terrible Western gender ideology is and how, important it is to reinforce essentially gendered hierarchies. And, that, in a sense, provides a core base for a lot of the far right. I talk about, going undercover with Vox in Spain. And similarly, the thing they obsess about, even more than race, they are racist, but the thing they obsess about is gender roles. And I find that fascinating.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I think actually it leads on nicely to a question, one of the questions that came from our audience around women in these movements. So the main project I work on at Open Democracy is called Tracking the Backlash, and you can see it at opendemocracy.net /tracking the backlash. And essentially it's a feminist investigative journalism project which tracks the backlash against women's and LGBTIQ rights around the world. And one of the things that we've noticed following these ultra conservative and far right movements, and which has often surprised me as a woman myself, is that there are women that are drawn to these movements. And so that was one of the questions from the audience as well. What is it that draws women to these movements? And I wonder if, Shon, you could answer that first.
Yeah, so I think the thing to say, I would probably slightly disagree with just with Adam's kind of like the term toxic masculinity is something I'm increasingly finding is too simplistic, even from my own worldview. And I think the reason being is I kind of think like you look at some people like R.W. Connell, who's a trans woman who theorized about masculinity, about the idea that there are multiple masculinities, right? Like there's the idea of the masculinity that Trump, for example, exhibits is very different to the kind of masculinity that might be seen, I don't know, in a working class estate, or the kind of masculinity the Fab Five exhibit, or the kind of masculinity that lesbian exhibits. So there is, a gender non-conforming lesbian. So there are multiple masculinities, and there's essentially a struggle for power in one. And if you like the idea that there's kind of in any given context, there might be one masculinity that kind of reproduces itself as the dominant one. And I think why that model is useful for thinking about women is because it does allow this kind of intersection, this idea of race in particular. I think that the huge aspect of women's attraction to the far right, is we're talking primarily about white women, is because one of the ways that perhaps certain hegemonic masculinities, white masculinities, kind of I don't know, kind of enact patriarchy on white women is to make them to make them kind of anxious, and to create a kind of femininity that needs to be protected and guarded, and that other women need to be policed. And that can include women of color, and that can include trans women, and that can include gender non-conforming lesbian women. And I think that's a huge attraction. I think it's the same thing, unfortunately, as you'd imagine that a woman who is herself suppressed, or has her freedom suppressed by a particularly kind of dominant mode of masculinity, would recognize that and not enact it on other people through a far right movement. But unfortunately, human beings don't really work that way. And I think what happens is that women can be as susceptible men in different ways to kind of support one kind of masculinity and one kind of gender role, and then its corresponding female role as fragile, white, feminine. In response, if that makes sense.
Yeah, completely. And I guess also kind of related to this, I'm going to go to you, Dan, and you touched on this briefly, Shon. One of the questions from the audience is, who made up the term toxic masculinity, and what does it even mean?
Oh, you've asked completely the wrong person. I don't know where it comes from. But picking up from the point that Shon was making very quickly about sort of multiple masculinities and multiple femininities, I think there is a sense that with someone like Peterson, you see, and someone like Trump in a slightly different register, you see someone trying to sort of offer a template, an idea of what being a man is, that's sort of close to the dominant view in a way, and it sort of reaches an absurd pitch in Trump, where Trump can never lose, right? Regardless of reality, he never loses. He's a winner by definition. And there's something really sort of interesting about seeing someone possessed by a version of masculinity in such an exposed and powerful position that it just becomes like a daily sort of dramatization of a personality in some sort of freefall. It's a very peculiar thing to see. And I suppose this touches on one of the comments that someone made in the chat about, we shouldn't sort of put aside or dismiss the self-help elements that someone like Peterson offers. I think our challenge is to say, well, what kinds of practical responses to modernity, to contemporary modernity, will actually be helpful? for individuals, whether they're men or women. And this is something that Adam talks about in the piece, obviously, that a lot of what we a lot of the time when we reach for self-help solutions, we do that, and they can be helpful. They can be helpful in the immediate term. But a lot of what ails us is much more amenable to cooperative action. It's much more amenable to not being stuck with our thoughts and caught up in this very solipsistic battle to somehow prevail and be the right kind of person for the world, but rather to kind of go out into the world and see how we change it. And that is, I don't think we think about that enough on the left as a kind of self-care, as it were. I mean, there's obviously a way of doing politics which is very bad for you. But there's a way of acting collectively that I think is just sort of fundamental to being human and is constantly derided and marginalized by capitalist culture. The things that will make us well are things almost by definition which don't involve market transactions. They don't involve the kind of manipulations that you see in so much of capitalist society. They're not competitive in the way that so much of our life is.
Yeah, completely. And I think that's another question that one of the audience members asked is, how do we rebuild in an inclusive way the sense of community and place that has been lost and that men now feel adrift in? I wonder whether you could speak to that, Adam.
I think, I mean, obviously that's a complex question, and it's a sense of how do you change all society. And, I'm not going to pretend that we have time now to talk about all the answers to that, or that those of us on this panel have all the answers to that. But I think that at least we can identify the problem. And the thing I keep coming back to is Jimmy Reed's famous speech from 1973, where he said, the word for the problem today is alienation. That, people are often miserable because they feel like they've lost any sense of control over their lives. And as the kind of question implies, the question then is, how do we take back control of our lives? And I do think that it's not a coincidence that a Leave campaign using that slogan 4 years ago won the Brexit referendum. They understood that was the burning desire people have in the modern world, is a sense that they've lost control and they want to take it back. And of course that gets racialized and becomes racist. It gets, interpreted through gender, and that's why there's a particular tendency for people from social groups which historically had more control to more vocally perhaps or to have more of a platform to talk about the sense they've lost it. If you didn't have any control before, you've not lost control, you just don't have it still. Whereas those of us from demographics which have lost control understand that we've lost it, and that produces a certain kind of misery and alienation. I think the answer to the question though is quite radical changes to our social, political, economic systems. And I feel like I'm not going to kind of deliver you a manifesto today, but I think that a combination of sort of radical democratic control of our societies and our lives ultimately is what's needed. And the Mark Fisher quote, the famous Mark Fisher quote, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism," was mentioned in the chat. And I think that what we have to start doing is imagining the end of capitalism.
Yeah, great. Actually, that's one of the next questions I was going to read out from the chat is from Anthony Barnett, who writes that Mark Fisher wrote a lot about the psychological damage of neoliberalism and the way it created depression. He also said, quoting Raymond Williams, had the effect of cancelling the future. The closure was part of its terrible power. And he says, but Adam and Dan speak of the same impact, but not with a sense that it is inescapable and that there is a route out. Do all of the panelists agree? Is there a route out? I'll go to you, Shon.
I mean, it's a huge, that's it. Yes, hopefully. I mean, you have to have optimism, optimism of the intellect. But I think, I think you do have to believe that. As I say, I think it's like it goes probably beyond the scope of like, there are so many things. I think obviously anti-capitalism. I would add as well that the reason I just thought my kind of trans feminist brain, I'm thinking back about why that maybe gender is such a focus for these far right movements, is because because in a different way, I think trans people represent a way out, often to onlookers too, potentially, of the idea that if there isn't this fused relationship between gender and sex, two things that we see as so essential and related to each other from birth, if there are people who exist who seem to challenge that notion, that can actually be very terrifying, because the reality of that, what are the implications? Even though trans people are such a tiny minority, if they exist, what are the implications for everyone else? And it's not that surprising that that they can easily become a scapegoat for the idea of proponents of an ideology. So, like, just as one example of is there a way out, is that if you're talking about the alienation that some of these young men feel, is that if you could imagine a gendered world in which there was more freedom, that perhaps they wouldn't feel so constrained by their own particular interpretation of masculinity too. If there was a way that people could be taught to embrace diversity in something like gender, that could be a kind of blueprint for the other types of way out that are probably beyond the scope of like panel answer. But it's just something I thought.
I mean, that's super interesting. I mean, very quickly on this. I mean, when the issue of transgender people first became public in a way in the 70s when I was a child, and I'm not pretending that everyone was incredibly enlightened and temperate in the way they responded, but the sense of panic that we see now in certain circles around this issue is different from how I think the issue was received in the 70s. I don't want to eulogize the 70s, but it seemed that people were more stable in a way. They had a clearer kind of sense of their place in the world, and so they perhaps could react with a bit more calmness to things that disrupted those certainties, as it were, in certain dimensions. I mean, if you've got, if you know you've got a job and you've got a place to live and you've got a place in the world, the fact that there are gay people in the world and there are transgender people in the world and that some women want to go out to work and so on isn't perhaps quite as threatening to so many people. Of course, there was a very strong reactionary currents in the 70s, which Thatcher exploited in order to pursue neoliberalism. I mean, it sort of builds itself on the kind of National Front mentality, but there is something peculiar to me, because I'm old enough to remember tabloid headlines about transgender people in the 1970s, which they weren't kind of paranoid and strange in the way that I think a lot of the discourse around this has become. I've lost my thread.
I just thought of one thing. Sorry to weigh in actually as well about ways out. Just because you were talking about the 70s, Dan, is I was thinking about that there were, in terms of mental health, in the 70s there were some radical movements thinking about, like, so the Socialist Patients Collective in Heidelberg in Germany, thinking about how mentally ill people could organize essentially against the dispossession that's happening to them by capitalist society and by increasing expectations of workers. And they had quite like a radical solution there. I talk about it in my video for Navarra. It's called, their slogan was "Turn illness into a weapon." The idea that actually, if you reimagine people who are disenfranchised by, so say, mental illness as a catch-all, that they could become a politically active group. I think the problem we face now is that actually the atomization, the kind of the stripping of welfare, means that people who are suffering with mental illness often, that's a very difficult group to get to organize. And even on the left, I think that's very hard too. It's very hard when people are essentially unwell, disenfranchised, deprived of resources, turn them into to encourage those people to become politically mobilized group is a huge challenge. But one I think that it would be interesting to have kind of contemporary left thought look at more. Just a thought.
No, I think that's, one of the comments I think speaks to this is that we're rushing towards solutions and not sitting with the discomfort of being here and now, as it were, and the extent to which we are living through a mental health crisis. and some people are more honest about it and react with kind of visible distress, and some people are better able at faking being okay with things. You know, you mentioned David Graeber at the beginning of this, and one of the things that's really striking about his writing was that he wrote very, very eloquently and beautifully about his relationship with his mother, and like he was willing to sort of acknowledge himself as it were, as a person. He wasn't this Olympian presence who had all the answers. He was sort of he was in that space, talking about what it felt like to be in various bureaucratic sort of nightmares and so on. He was sort of a character in his writing in a way I thought was quite rare in political writing. And you know, Adam's piece, quite a rare move, and it's sort of saying, actually, I'm not okay. You know, there are ways in which this is difficult, and there are things that helped. There are things that helped sort of improve his mental health. And again, like touching on what we said earlier, I mean, there are things we can do, and there are things that people try that work, and we should perhaps spend a bit of time trying to listen to what does work for people.
Yeah, completely. And I think, like, going back to your piece, Adam, one of the things that I found interesting about it, I mean, of course, you seem like a mega fan, but you did have some reservations around Queer Eye needing a makeover, and I found that really interesting. Could you talk a bit about why you think they need to unionize?
Sure. So I think that there's a kind of it feels very much like American liberalism is on a journey, and to use that kind of overwrought metaphor, in the sense that people have begun to adopt a more perhaps radical, more critical analysis of things like race and gender than they might have done sort of 20 years ago, for a whole range of reasons. But they are only just beginning to really think through class politics in any kind of popular culture way. And of course, there are, you know, obvious political reasons why. You know, you look at the rise of Bernie Sanders, you look at the success of AOC, etc., and it's not surprising that there begins to be a kind of beginnings of popular culture responses to those things. But there is, you know, absolutely no example I can think of. And to be honest, this was a point that Dan made to me. I was talking to him on the phone about the piece as I was writing it. No popular culture example I can think of kind of an exploration of class organizing. So there's obviously lots and lots of examples of, you know, poverty and explorations to some extent of modern class politics in America through American popular culture. But you look at the sort of milieu of reality TV and makeover shows, you know, historically they used to, by which I mean 10 years ago, they were all about house price inflation, both in Britain and America. You know, you do over a house, you make it worth more, you set it on. And that was very, you know, you could tell that there's a housing bubble from the fact that you had this endless stream of terrible TV shows about how to make your house price worth more. And what we've not had in recent times, and what even Queer Eye doesn't manage to do, is give people any kind of sensible answer to the question, how do you really progress economically? And what the show often does is kind of take people through sort of struggling businessmen, and I say men because it's, as I say, largely men, through the kind of processes needed to advance their personal business. And of course, you know, what they're doing in practice is giving them a massive capital investment and consultancy from Netflix. So of course that will help a very, you know, the actual businesses on the actual show to do better. But all stats show that's a very, very bad way to advance economically. You know, most businesses fail, most small businesses get crushed by bigger rivals. You know, the class system, particularly in America, but also in general, reinforces itself and reproduces itself. And really the way to thrive economically is join a trade union. You know, the stats are very clear that unionized workers in America are paid substantially more than non-unionized workers. And yet there's no show which says to people, hey, want to get on in life? Organize your workplace. And so, and it was from a conversation between me and Dan that this idea entered the article. I think it was probably Dan's idea. But the suggestion was, yeah, that Queer Eye, if it's going to take the same approach as it has already done, I think, to gender, teaching men how to challenge kind of some ideas of their own genders, then you know, if it's going to take the same approach to class, which it needs to start doing if it's going to help people progress and genuinely teach good lessons about things other than how to dress, then that's exactly what it should do. And so I think they need to recruit a trade union organizer.
I was just thinking though that I was just thought that actually the reality TV that I remember growing up with, I'd say it was class conscious, but kind of in a very negative way. Like certainly in Britain, that kind of in the noughties or whatever, that there was this kind of presentation of kind of working class, but kind of always either as objects of ridicule, but also of personal blame. The idea that kind of your class position was kind of a failing. You know, even stuff like wife swap or I don't know, working class families who appeared on things like Super Nanny. The idea that there was this kind of degeneracy was actually very, very popular. Unfortunately, that seems to have abated, but we're only really in the immediate post-classist, you know, where like, how many, you know, in the Blair years, how many reality TV documentaries are devoted to benefits lounges? So, I mean, like, I think we're a long way off television having such an inversion. And the trouble is that I think at the moment we seem to be with like Instagram, with, you know, going back to mental health, and when talking about self-care, mental health, is that there's almost kind of a co-option. We're almost in the stage now where it's like the idea that the more that we talk about these issues, like mental health, for example, instead of having a class analysis, we're encouraged to have kind of a consumerist one about, you know, if you buy this way, if you live this way, or if you have this mindfulness app, that like somehow that's going to be the answer. So I mean, I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but I guess I am being. But yeah, I mean, I'm all for the unionizing.
Well, I suppose. Sorry, we done. Yeah. And I suppose for me, that's a sort of, you know, what neoliberalism is all about, for the market at least, for capital, is monetizing everything it possibly can. So it's not surprising that as, you know, human experiences change, and as often the left organizes in order to improve the human experience, the market will try and monetize everything you do. You know, capital will always show up and, you know, stand at the door trying to tell you something. And so, you know, what I think is interesting is that it's also the case that neoliberalism is in a real crisis. And, you know, to come back to Anthony's question earlier about hope, I think that, you know, the fact that they are, you know, so desperately trying to monetize the last thing that they have, which is the misery they've created, shows that they're beginning to run out of ideas. And that's, you know, hope that there's a new system of a sort, or a new, you know, system coming of a sort.
And one of the comments in the chat from Lawrence Connolly mentions that a very specific way out for these members of far-right organizations are programs like Life After Hate in the US. And they focus on the sense of loss of community and family and support. And Lawrence is asking, can we use this example on a wider or more generic scale?
I'm afraid I'm not familiar with the show he's referring to, so I don't know.
That's it.
I mean, can I just quickly speak to Adam's point about a union organizer on Queer Eye? There's a podcaster, I've listened to a lot of podcasts over the last few months, I don't know why, called Josh Olson, who works in Hollywood, and he talks about a reboot of Death Wish, Charles Bronson sort of exploitation shocker. And he went to the studio and he said, look, well, what about if we did a reboot of Death Wish that where he targeted big time white collar criminals, and he sort of blew away corrupt bankers and stuff like that. And the movie executive said, yeah, I mean, I can see where you're going with that, but we just don't want those ideas out there, right? Now, I don't think there's a sort of coordinated sort of committee necessarily in popular culture that decides what sorts of discourse are ready for prime time. But I think, again, I think we've been quite bad at realizing just how hostile popular culture, as it were, as an industrial sector, how hostile it is to the kinds of descriptions of human flourishing that we, on the left, find more plausible. It's almost impossible to see examples, as Adam says, of successful organizing that isn't structured towards profit. Right? Every week on The Apprentice, you'll see groups of people cooperating to make money to impress the boss, right? I mean, this is sort of like, it's a straight read across. You come home from your working day where you've been trying to do that, to watch it happening again, but with some helicopter shots. You know, I mean, it's very striking how popular culture reproduces that value system about like what is it to be together. You can be together in a romantic relationship, in a family relationship, or in a work relationship governed by considerations of profit and competition. You can't be together as it were cooperative political animals who get together to pursue their interests in a clear-eyed way. You know, you can be in a crowd listening to someone talk, but you never see people being, as it were, political equals. You never see that. It's really striking. And that is, again, like, we have to be aware that we are on incredibly hostile terrain in that sense.
And one of the questions in the chat is asking specifically about whether panelists could talk about the impact of the rise of authoritarian leaders like Trump and Bolsonaro on the perception of gender and masculinity. I'll go to you, Adam.
Yeah, I'm going to say something controversial, which is, in a sense, I think what they've done is put center stage what's always been a part of what's going on, and do it so grotesquely that most people begin to react against it. And I think that, you know, when I talk about the sort of more positive bits of popular culture, like the you know, the way that American liberalism is perhaps developing a more critical analysis of at least race and class, partly I think that is in response to the kind of ogre that is Trump. And so, you know, the fact that then, you know, that these figures distilled so much of their, you know, the voice that they were speaking for, and they are speaking to that particular part of their own cultures, but they distilled it so well, a large number of people, and you know, it's very structured by age, so a lot of, you know, particularly younger people have reacted very negatively against it. And I think that has clarified what's going on. You know, to kind of use the Marxist words, it's rarefied. It's turned that thing into a thing that people recognize. And so, you know, lots and lots of people are now more able to understand why these are negative traits and what's wrong with these things. And there's something wrong with the world in general. It's not just these individuals, because people vote for these people, than we saw before this kind of era of the return of these kind of particular types of male leaders. And, you know, I think that, well, we can talk about why that's happened, but I think actually that is, you know, that is the main effect. And as I kind of concluded my piece, you know, the other thing that was remarkable about the European elections last year and covering them was it became quite clear going around Europe that the far right was not going to do nearly as well as both they and most of the sort of centrist media were predicting. You know, there's always talking up of Fidesz in Hungary and so on and so on, and how between them they were going to storm European elections. And that was what we were kind of covering at the time. It became quite clear that the real thing that was going to happen was that millions and millions of young people were going to show up, having not voted before, to vote against that. And is that kind of troll-like, ogre-like figure that they were mobilized against. And that's, you know, by clarifying what's going on, it's in a sense a good thing.
I was just wondering, in terms of populist figures and gender, is probably worth, I don't know, I was thinking about the relationship between how particularly liberals tend to see, for example, Trump, but also Boris Johnson, but I think Bolsonaro is perhaps even a shade further on, but I think to see them as kind of somehow an interruption in the present order because of their seeming lack of regard for decorum or for even kind of certain I don't know, qualifications or gentlemanliness or chivalry of masculinity that we expect from kind of leaders on the world stage. But when you kind of look, like, for example, you know, like both candidates for the US presidency have allegations of sexual assault against them. Like most of these populist figures, and it just seems like it doesn't touch them, it doesn't matter. But that's also a disturbing reflection, really. It's an embodiment. It's not actually not a departure from our culture. You know, like the signs that because of what's happened to criminal justice, because of austerity, you know, there was basically a report that a couple of weeks ago that like rape is functionally non-criminalized now because of the conviction rates and because of how long it takes things to bring to trial. Is that actually these people are embodiments, these men are embodiments of our present gender relations in society, and in many ways it's not that they're not being brought to task for it, it's almost that they are in power because they represent this kind of masculinity that that actually our present social relations seem to be uplifting and actually, you know, certainly condoning without consequences. And I think that's a really different interpretation to the liberal idea that constantly that like Trump's a misogynist and this kind of confusion that if we keep pushing the fact that he's a misogynist, that people are going to wake up and realize when actually the fact that he's a misogynist is actually one of the main reasons people vote for him.
Yeah, that's very true.
And one of the comments is asking whether isn't this all about the incestuous nature of the media, the clearly and big business protecting the status quo. And I saw another comment earlier on also in relation to when we were talking about the 1970s and trans rights then, and they said that that people weren't as manipulated by the media and the internet back then. How far do you think that that's the case, Shon?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I'd say what would happen. I'm not saying that, you know, I don't think there was, I know some trans people who were out as trans in the 70s, and I think that it was certainly a very different landscape, right? That the media, I think what happened is that the media has given trans people a new visibility, which didn't exist at the time. That gives us lots of advantages. But there is a huge manipulation. Like, I mean, I feel like in Britain at the moment, trans people are at the center of a media class that has decided to completely misrepresent trans lives, the issues that are facing trans people, what even the conversation about trans people should be, is actually very divorced from if you're in a kind of activist meeting to what might be in the pages of the Times. Yeah, I think it is. I think that probably the mass media, it's that kind of double-edged sword. I think it's given minorities who are such a small minority, like 0.6% of the population, it's given them a huge way, mass media, to understand each other, to kind of learn more from each other. But it has also made us much more susceptible to manipulation, because like the reality probably is that actually most people don't care enough, which is good, and they're kind of like largely apathetic to whether or not if a trans person's bothering them or not. But like as with all moral panics, I do think, yeah, I think there's a huge interplay. I mean, there's a huge argument to say that, for example, and I just know this because it's the example that affects me most, is that you know, the Times, the Sunday Times, one of the big reasons that they took a huge kind of moral crusade against trans rights, Gender Recognition Act, was because they wanted to unseat Theresa May, because it was a big liberal move, was to advance trans rights, and they didn't really want, because they were worried that she was going to bungle Brexit and they preferred Boris. So there is this idea that there is probably manipulation, and actually sometimes people are being used as a scapegoat or a sideshow, and I think that's very much the case.
Great, thank you. And I think we'll wrap up shortly, but I wonder if any of the panelists have any like final optimistic notes to end on. Like Dan, where is Jordan Peterson now? Is his influence is he still as powerful as he was a few years ago?
He's certainly not as prominent, and that's partly to do with his sort of tempestuous sort of biography, as it were. But I think we shouldn't be. We shouldn't be kind of naive. I mean, I think there's going to be one snake oil salesman after another who will arrive with a key that opens the door and says, if you buy into this model, which is hyper competitive, and that does trade on apparently kind of cosmic certainties of one kind or another, then they will find adherents, and they will kind of help to solidify people into online collectivities, maybe primarily, but also, you know, there is a long tradition of a certain sort of social Darwinism, a certain sort of hyper competitiveness tied to cosmological claims, if you like. That is one of the tributaries of fascism. That's part of how the fascist subjectivity is created. It creates a sort of dramatic narrative where individuals who feel radically unmoored can take a starring role, if you like. They can suddenly be full of certainty. They have agency suddenly. And again, this is part of the way that the current order seeps into all of our bones. We all want to be the star. We all want to be the center of the action. And there is something appealing about that. It's not that we are purely cooperative creatures that have been led astray by a wicked media system. Like, it works with elements of our nature. It works with part of who we are. I was reading Autumn Journal recently by Lou McNeice, and there's an example of a man trying to get to grips and be honest with the fact that part of him does just want to be rich and to be able to buy the company of beautiful women and buy luxury. But he wants to be a socialist, but he doesn't want to sort of downplay the fact that capitalism is in his bones too. So it's always going to be a standing temptation for people to turn up and say, yeah, it's okay to be that. It's okay to want everything. And it will ring a bell with a lot of people who are unhappy. It will ring a bell with a lot of people who are just sort of motivated more selfishly than the normal run of people. So Peterson is somewhat in eclipse. I still think he's an interesting figure. I think Dawkins is an interesting figure, because in a sense they're kind of unwitting poets. They operate through a kind of series of poetic maneuvers, and they do offer us a kind of interesting insight into sort of aspects of our dream life. But as you know, Adam says in the piece, it's like this is a dream life that is materially constructed, even though it presents itself, or its kind of manipulators or kind of hucksters present this as being a fundamental truth about human nature. It's a product of our moment, which to repeat the point, is like making more and more of us more and more unhappy. The convention is that we don't sort of show our pain in public fora like this, but yeah, it's there. It's obviously that we're all struggling.
Thanks. Any final points, Adam?
Yeah, sure. I should be grateful. I should mention Anthony Barnett, who's on this, who pointed this out to me as we discussed this piece before too. I can't help but think throughout this call about the way that Gramsci described how the system defends itself, not just, or the market system defends itself, not just through its own power, but also through the power of institutions like, the churches and school systems and nations and so on, which you can understand as kind of systems that reinforce gender and racial ideologies. I think that there's a way to see what's happened over the last decade, which is people have stopped really arguing for a kind of neoliberal or even capitalist system. And you look at the polling, most people don't really believe in a sort of capitalist type economic system anymore. And so they've had to kind of withdraw to the back ranks of the system to defend itself, which are gender and race. And that's why I think we're seeing increasing discussion to some extent of gender and race, and increasing extent to which the right is trying to reinforce those hierarchies. And what that shows is not that they're strong, but that they're weak. And, so in that sense, yes, I'm hopeful.
Brilliant, thank you. And Shon, any last thoughts, feelings, wrap up?
The only thing I'm optimistic about, which I say all the time, is that young people seem to, like Gen Z, tend to not be having any of this. So they realize that we're screwing the climate. They seem to not be putting up with anything. There was kind of the A-level marches. So I'm kind of just hopeful that there'll be kind of just like a refusal to embrace the abyss. So that's where my hope comes from. No pressure to 16-year-olds.
I like that. That's something you also mentioned in your piece, Adam, towards the end. But you also said that it would need someone else a bit younger to write that piece. But thank you so much for everyone for joining us, and thanks to Shon and Dan and Adam and to our audience. We do have a weekly debate, so you can check our website and social media for more details, and you can also sign up to our weekly newsletter, and the link should be in the chat. And if you want to know more about feminist investigative journalism and the Tracking the Backlash investigations we've been doing, go to opendemocracy.net /tracking the backlash. And finally, Open Democracy does rely on contributions and donations. So if you want to see more public interest journalism like this, please do consider supporting us. And thank you all again. Hope to see you all next week for another very interesting discussion, I'm sure. Bye.
Thanks, Nandi. Bye.
Thank you.